Quantum leaders, the architect. Consciousness as architect, not bystander. The architect's natural style, methodical, structured, and long-range, is inherently design-oriented. But while they may see themselves as building systems, in truth they are also transmitting consciousness. Through the quantum principle that consciousness is not a bystander, but the architect itself, the architect begins to see that their thoughts, values, and assumptions are not just influencing the structure. They are the structure. Every framework they create carries the embedded signature of how they think, what they believe, and how they hold uncertainty. Their outer systems reflect their inner systems. Their leadership rises when they design not just with intelligence, but with presence. With a motivation direction of away from, the architect seeks to prevent error, collapse, and inefficiency. That mindset can create strong, resilient frameworks. But if fueled by fear, it also encodes anxiety, distrust, or rigidity into the design. Consciousness as architect invites them to ask, what state am I designing from? If their mindset is spacious, calm, and generative, their systems become quietly stabilizing. They don't just prevent collapse, they invite coherence. Their attention focus on self provides internal consistency. But if they design solely from personal perspective, their systems become closed loops. The mature architect shifts from self-reference to systemic resonance, not abandoning their view, but designing from a place of collective intelligence. When they ask not just what makes sense to me, but also what does this system want to become, they become a channel, not just a controller. With an internal frame of reference, they trust their inner logic, but that logic must evolve. Consciousness as architect challenges them to examine the source code of their assumptions. Are they designing from scarcity or abundance? From reactivity or wisdom? From hierarchy or flow? Their consciousness doesn't just inform the work, it becomes the DNA of every structure they build. Their procedural operational style creates stable processes. But procedures are never neutral. They communicate culture. They instruct behavior. A rigid process may unconsciously encode distrust. A loose one may signal neglect. When the architect becomes aware of what each structure communicates beyond its function, they stop building for efficiency alone and start building for meaning. Their specific viewpoint gives them mastery over detail. But every detail they define transmits an embedded tone. How much autonomy someone has, how much trust is extended, how much flexibility is allowed. The conscious architect designs not just for outcome, but for emotional imprint. What does this detail feel like to follow? What does this protocol teach people about the system? The answers shape the experience. With a solo work preference, they often design in solitude. But the state they're in while building, rushed or grounded, skeptical or curious, seeps into the system. Others may never see the architect at work, but they live inside the residual tone of that design. When the architect slows down, clears their mind, and builds from clarity, their structures carry not just function, but integrity. Their emotional engagement is dissociated. They aim to stay above emotional noise. But emotion still infuses their work, if not through feeling, then through omission. Systems built without emotional intelligence often feel cold, rigid, or alienating. The architect evolves when they consider how the structure feels to live in. Designing with warmth doesn't mean compromising clarity. It means embedding humanity into the blueprint. As matchers, they lean on what has proven effective. But every repeated structure carries the mindset it was born in. If that mindset is outdated, built from past fear, scarcity, or control, repeating it replicates that old consciousness. The mature architect revisits legacy systems and asks, what energy was this built in? Is that energy still relevant? If not, it's time to refactor the consciousness beneath the form. Their through-time orientation offers visionary sequencing. But timelines are also carriers of stress or spaciousness. The architect builds quantum leadership by designing time itself, not just when things happen, but how they are experienced. Do timelines feel punitive or empowering? Compressed or alive? Their timelines don't just manage output, they sculpt experience and perception of flow. And with a primary drive of things, they build tangible structures. But those structures are consciousness made visible. A dashboard, a workflow, a physical space, all are extensions of the mental emotional state they were created in. The conscious architect learns to treat building as transmission. What they think, feel, and expect becomes form. Their systems evolve not just when logic improves, but when consciousness clears. In this frame, the architect is no longer a hidden force behind the curtain. They are the living code inside the system. What they hold becomes what the world holds. Their designs stop being just efficient, they become embodied clarity. When they elevate their consciousness, they elevate every structure they touch. And in doing so, they become not just a designer of systems, but a custodian of coherence. Quantum leader is the architect. Polarity creates the blueprint of experience. The architect's natural style, disciplined, long-term, and principle-focused, is shaped around order. They thrive in predictability, precision, and logical consistency. But through the quantum principle that polarity creates experience, the architect comes to understand that their strength doesn't lie in eliminating tension. It lies in designing with it. Every structural choice, every sequence, every container they build exists at the crossroads of opposites: control and adaptability, clarity and complexity, rules and responsiveness. When they begin to design for both poles rather than suppressing one, their systems become not just stable, but regenerative. With a motivation direction of away from, the architect aims to prevent inefficiency, collapse, and risk. The polarity here is caution versus momentum. Too much caution locks the system. Too much speed degrades the design. When the architect integrates risk awareness with strategic movement, they create frameworks that are both safe and scalable, systems that learn as they move forward. Their attention focus on self grants internal consistency. The polarity is autonomy versus openness. If they stay only in their own logic, they risk designing in isolation. If they overextend into others' expectations, the integrity of the structure frays. The mature architect toggles between internal alignment and external tuning, building systems that are both principled and porous. With an internal frame of reference, they trust their reasoning. The polarity is certainty versus curiosity. Certainty gives backbone. Curiosity brings breath. If they hold too tightly to what they know, innovation stalls. If they question everything, foundations dissolve. The architect thrives when they hold the polarity. This is true enough for now, and still open to revision. This mindset evolves the blueprint in real time. Their procedural operational style emphasizes repeatable logic. The polarity is structure versus spontaneity. The architect refines when they build rigid enough to hold shape, but loose enough to flex under pressure. Systems must bend without breaking. This polarity becomes a core design principle, not something to resolve, but something to sustain. Their specific viewpoint grants a mastery of micro details. The polarity here is detail versus direction. Too much zoom in loses the purpose. Too much abstraction forgets the steps. The wise architect oscillates intentionally, designing systems that stay grounded in execution and lift toward vision. Their leadership is revealed in where they focus when it matters most. With a solo work preference, they excel in independent ideation. The polarity is solitude versus collaboration. Too much solitude breeds perfectionism. Too much collaboration muddies clarity. When they alternate between deep personal design and intentional peer feedback, they encode coherence that is both visionary and applicable. The system becomes lived, not just imagined. Their emotional engagement is dissociated. They prioritize logic over feeling. The polarity is neutrality versus empathy. Too much neutrality makes their systems feel sterile. Too much emotion clouds structure. The architect refines when they design with feeling in mind, even if they do not feel it fully themselves. Their systems begin to hold humans, not just hold function. As matchers, they respect what has worked. The polarity is tradition versus innovation. They honor past structures while testing what else might serve. When they hold legacy as foundation, not ceiling, they evolve the system without severing its roots. Their innovation becomes anchored evolution, respectful, radical, and refined. Their through-time orientation supports planning and phasing. The polarity here is linear time versus emergent timing. Too much planning resists new information. Too much surrender loses direction. The architect leads when they sequence intelligently, but stay attuned to field readiness. Their timelines breathe, their pivots are purposeful, and with a primary drive of things, they move through results and tangible output. The polarity is delivery versus discernment. when to push to finish, when to pause to reevaluate. Their maturity comes from knowing that not all completion is success. Some things must be unbuilt or rebuilt. Some outputs are ready only after they rest. Their systems become artifacts of timing, not just effort. In this frame, the architect is revealed as more than a builder. They are a designer of dynamic opposites. Their brilliance lies not in eliminating tension, but in encoding it into the structure itself. They stop trying to resolve contradiction and start designing with it as a resource. Their systems don't just hold function, they hold the living dance of life inside the form. That is where their genius matures, from stable planner to polarity integrated visionary. Quantum leaders, the architect. Quantum entanglement, the thread between all things. The architect's natural style, deliberate, order-focused, and grounded in systemic, often gives the impression of separateness, planning behind the scenes, designing from a distance, and managing complexity through clean boundaries. Yet through the quantum principle of entanglement, a humbling and powerful truth emerges. The architect is never outside the system they are shaping. Every plan they draft, every sequence they code, every structure they implement is energetically connected to the emotional field, the cultural undercurrents, and the people it is meant to serve. Their impact doesn't just live in logic, it radiates through subtle fields of resonance. With a motivation direction of away from, the architect designs to prevent breakdowns and protect systemic integrity. But even well-intentioned prevention can send signals that failure is not allowed, that trust is conditional, that perfection is the price of participation. When the architect recognizes every protective feature sends an energetic message, they shift from designing for control to designing for safe emergence. Their systems begin to carry an invisible invitation to evolve, not just a shield from collapse. Their attention focus on self creates consistency, but the field is relational. What the architect holds internally, urgency, tension, doubt, or calm, filters into their structures. A process built in anxiety often feels rigid. A policy born from clarity and trust carries room to breathe. The architect becomes powerful when they intentionally align their inner state with the tone they want their systems to hold. Their quiet consciousness becomes an architectural echo across the team. With an internal frame of reference, they trust their own standards. But entanglement reminds them, those standards shape more than the outcome. They shape how people feel while interacting with the outcome. If their internal benchmark is perfection, the system may become energetically brittle. If their benchmark is progress with integrity, the system relaxes. The architect's mindset codes emotional and cultural values into every design decision. Their procedural operational style creates structure. But procedures do not live in isolation. They ripple. A step that is slightly unclear may cause shame. A checkpoint that lacks feedback may generate disengagement. The architect evolves when they view procedures not as instructions, but as relational touchpoints. How does this make someone feel? What is it inviting or discouraging? Their systems become alive with subtle ethics. Their specific viewpoint gives them an eye for detail, but every detail amplifies a message. A word choice in a form, the spacing in a workflow, a visual frame in a presentation. These tiny decisions encode trust or friction. When the architect chooses detail with awareness of the energy it transmits, their systems begin to speak coherence even in silence. With a solo work preference, they often design alone. But entanglement teaches, your solitude still influences others. The quality of presence they hold while building is felt downstream. Did they design while centered, frustrated, inspired? These tones become part of the structure's DNA. When the architect begins using solo time to tune their inner field, they become a remote stabilizer across the organization. Their emotional engagement is dissociated. They prefer to stay focused on clarity, not effect. But affect exists regardless. The absence of emotional design still communicates something: coldness, distance, impersonality. The architect matures when they consider, how does this feel to move through? What emotional posture does this process assume of its users? They don't need to become emotional. They need to design with emotional awareness. As matchers, they respect systems that work. But entanglement means that what worked in one context may carry emotional or relational residue that doesn't translate. A high-efficiency tool from a high-pressure culture may replicate that pressure. The conscious architect doesn't just import best practices, they tune methods to the present field. Their systems hum not with legacy, but with current resonance. Their through-time orientation gives them a long-range view. But timelines don't just organize tasks, they regulate nervous systems. An aggressive deadline compresses breath. A generous sequence builds trust. The architect becomes quantum when they design time not just for delivery, but for health, trust, and rhythm. Their timelines become energetic corridors, not just calendars. And with the primary drive of things, they naturally focus on tangible output. But each thing is entangled with unseen layers. A reporting system becomes a trust system. A workflow becomes a culture shaper. A form becomes a voice. When the architect begins to see that every structure is a social signal, they design not just for use, but for belonging, safety, and evolution. In this quantum view, the architect becomes far more than a designer of systems. They become a conscious steward of how those systems feel, function, and ripple. They are no longer behind the scenes. They are at the center of the energetic network, sending frequency into form. And when they choose clarity, presence, and trust while building, their structures don't just work. They heal, invite, and uplift. They become living systems of coherence.